You open your Bible to Paul's letters, and suddenly, you hit a wall. Women should remain silent in the churches. Wives, submit to your husbands. It feels like a gut punch, especially if you're a woman who loves Jesus but also believes in equality. So what's really going on here? Was Paul a first-century misogynist? Or is there something deeper, even liberating, hidden in these controversial texts? Buckle up, because this is not the Sunday school version of Paul you've heard before. 1. The problem we can't ignore. Let's be honest. Some of Paul's words about women sound painfully outdated. 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. Ouch. For centuries, these verses have been used to silence women, exclude them from leadership, and justify inequality. And if you've ever sat in a church where women weren't allowed to speak, you know how damaging this can feel. But here's the twist. What if we've been misreading Paul all along? The tension becomes even clearer when you compare Paul's letters side by side. In 1 Corinthians 14, he tells women to remain silent, yet just 3 chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 11, he gives instructions for how women should pray and prophesy in church, clearly assuming they would be speaking publicly. This is not just a contradiction. It's proof that we're missing something crucial. The early church was not debating whether women could speak. They were working out how it should be done respectfully in their cultural context. And let's talk about that word silence. The Greek word Paul uses, sigao, does not mean permanent muteness. It means to hold peace or stop talking, often in a specific disruptive situation. It's the same word used when Jesus tells the storm to be still. No one thinks the wind was permanently silenced. It was a temporary command for a specific chaos. When we read Paul's words through this lens, everything changes. 2. The cultural blind spot. Paul was not writing in a vacuum. He was addressing specific churches with specific problems. Take Corinth, a city obsessed with status, where wealthy women were disrupting worship to show off their spiritual gifts. Paul's command for women to remain silent was not a universal decree. It was damage control. Imagine a modern pastor saying, "Hey, stop yelling during service." We would not assume he's banning all speech forever. Context changes everything. Corinth was not just any city. It was the Las Vegas of the ancient world, known for its temple prostitutes and wild parties. The church there was brand new, trying to figure out how to worship God in a culture where women's voices were either sexualized or suppressed. Some wealthy women, newly empowered by Christianity, were apparently interrupting services to show off their spiritual gifts, like speaking in tongues, without interpretation, a major issue Paul addresses repeatedly in 1 Corinthians. This explains why Paul's letters to Corinth sound so different from his letter to the Romans, where he openly celebrates female leaders. He was not being inconsistent, he was being strategic. Imagine a youth pastor today giving different advice to a party-hard college group versus a quiet retirement community. Same gospel, different applications. The tragedy is that we've taken his situational advice and turned it into universal law. 3. The first glimpse of hope. Now, here's where it gets surprising. Flip over to Romans 16, and you'll find Paul shouting out women like Phoebe, a deacon, and Eunia, an apostle. These weren't sideline figures, they were leaders. And in Galatians 3 verse 28, Paul drops the mic. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. That's radical for the ancient world. So why the mixed messages? Because Paul was not contradicting himself. He was navigating a cultural minefield while planting seeds of equality. Eunia's story gets even more fascinating when you dig into the historical record. Early church fathers like John Chrysostom, 4th century, praised her as an outstanding apostle, no question about her gender or role. The attempt to masculinize her name did not start until the Middle Ages, when female leadership became threatening to the institutional church. This was not just about translation, it was about power. And Phoebe was not just any deacon, the Greek term. Think about that. The most theological letter in the New Testament was hand-delivered by a woman. That tells us everything about Paul's real views on women's capabilities. 4. The power of lost translations. Ever heard of Eunia? For centuries, translators changed her name to Eunias, a male name, because the idea of a female apostle was unthinkable. That's not a typo, it's erasure. Even today, some Bibles downplay Phoebe's role as a deacon by calling her a servant. But here's what they do not want you to know. The early church was full of women in leadership. The problem is not Paul, it's how we've chosen to read him. The cover-up went beyond names. In 1 Corinthians 11 verse 10, Paul says women should have authority on their heads when praying/prophesying, but some translations changed this to veil or covering, obscuring the radical idea that women exercised spiritual authority. The Greek word exousia literally means authority, the same word used for Christ's power in Matthew 28 verse 18. Paul was not restricting women, he was explaining how their authority should be visibly recognized in worship. Even more telling, the early church followed through. Archaeologists have found 2nd to 3rd century tombstones of female bishops, teachers, and even apostles like Thecla. These women weren't anomalies. They were living out Paul's vision before later generations erased them. When we peel back the layers of tradition, we find a 1st century church that looked more progressive than many congregations today. 5. The real oppression. Let's name it. The church has weaponized Paul's words to control women. But oppression was not Paul's goal. It was the very thing he fought against. When he told wives to submit to husbands, Ephesians 5, he immediately told husbands to lay down their lives for their wives, just as Christ did for the church. That's mutual sacrifice, not domination. The tragedy? We've ignored the second half for 2,000 years. Paul's marriage advice in Ephesians 5 was revolutionary when you compare it to other ancient writings. Aristotle taught that wives were naturally inferior to husbands. Roman law gave husbands life and death power over their families. Then Paul comes along and says marriage should mirror Christ's sacrificial love, where the husband's role is not to dominate, but to serve to the point of death. This flipped the entire ancient world's power structure upside down. The tragedy? We've cherry-picked the wives submit part while ignoring the earth-shattering demand that husbands love like Jesus. No ancient man would have heard this as permission to boss his wife around. They would have been shocked at the weight of responsibility placed on husbands. When we quote Ephesians 5 selectively, we do not just distort Paul, we betray the radical mutuality he actually taught. 6. The game changer. Here's the breakthrough. Paul's letters contain some of the most pro-women statements in ancient literature. In 1 Corinthians 7, he says husbands and wives have equal authority over each other's bodies, a shocking idea in a culture where women were property. And in Philippians 4 verse 3, he praises Euodia and Syntyche as co-workers who contended at my side for the gospel. These women weren't assistants, they were partners. Paul's statement about mutual authority in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 4 was unprecedented in ancient literature. Roman wives had no legal rights over their husbands' bodies. Marriage was about producing heirs, not mutual pleasure. For Paul to say the wife does not have authority over her own body but yields it to her husband, and vice versa, was a bombshell. This was not just equality. It was a sexual revolution centuries ahead of its time. Even more striking, Paul elevates singleness as equally valid to marriage. 1 Corinthians 7 verses 7 to 8. Something unheard of in a culture where women's worth was tied to childbearing. By affirming unmarried women like Lydia and Phoebe as full members of Christ's body, Paul dismantled the ancient world's entire framework of female value. This was not just progressive, it was dangerous. 7. The modern dilemma. So why does this still feel messy? Because we're trying to apply ancient letters to modern contexts without nuance. Have you ever been told you cannot lead because of your gender? That's not biblical. It's tradition masquerading as truth. The early church had female apostles, prophets, and teachers. If we're going to take Paul seriously, we have to wrestle with all his words, not just the convenient ones. The messy reality is that Paul was both a product of his time and far ahead of it. He could not outright reject slavery. Philemon shows his subversive approach there, but he planted seeds that would later destroy the system. Similarly, he worked within first-century gender norms while simultaneously undermining them. The problem is not Paul, it's when we freeze his cultural adaptations as eternal rules. Think about it. We do not enforce Paul's head coverings, 1 Corinthians 11, or bans on braided hair, 1 Timothy 2 verse 9, today. We recognize those as time-bound instructions. Why do we treat his other statements about women as timeless? Either all of it is cultural or none of it is. The church cannot have it both ways. 8. The liberating truth. What if Paul's letters are not a cage for women, but a key? In a world where women were invisible, Paul named them, thanked them, and entrusted them with the gospel. The same Paul who said, women should be silent, also said, every woman who prays or prophesies should do so with her head covered. Wait, Women were praying and prophesying in church? Exactly. The silence command was not absolute. It was situational. The head-covering passage, 1 Corinthians 11 verses 2 to 16, proves women were leading worship. Paul is not debating if they should pray/prophesy, he's discussing how. In fact, his concern is that women do so with proper authority, exousia, on their heads. Some scholars argue this authority was a woman's own decision to veil, a public claim to spiritual authority in a culture where unveiled women were assumed to be prostitutes or slaves. This changes everything. The issue was not women speaking. It was ensuring their leadership was culturally recognizable as holy, not scandalous. Paul was not silencing women. He was protecting their right to be heard without their message getting lost in cultural taboos. Today's equivalent might be advising a female pastor on how to dress professionally so congregations focus on her teaching, not her outfit. 9. The women Paul celebrated. Let's meet the women Paul championed. Priscilla, who taught Apollos, a man, the full gospel. Lydia, the first European convert, who hosted the church in her home. Nympha, who led a house church. These women weren't exceptions, they were the norm. The early church thrived because of women's leadership, not in spite of it. So why do we act like Paul would freak out over a female pastor? Priscilla's story is especially revealing. In Acts 18 verse 26, she and her husband Aquila explained the way of God more adequately to Apollos, a respected male preacher. Notice the order, Priscilla and Aquila, not Aquila and Priscilla. In 6 out of 7 New Testament mentions, her name comes first, highly unusual in a patriarchal society, suggesting she was the more prominent teacher. Lydia's conversion, Acts 16, follows the same pattern. Paul does not preach to her husband. She's the head of her household and the first European Christian. When the gospel crossed into new territory, it was a businesswoman, not a man, who became the cornerstone. This was not accidental. It was God's pattern breaking through human prejudice again and again. 10. The choice we face today. Here's the bottom line. We can keep using Paul to justify inequality. Or we can read him in full context and see a revolutionary who elevated women in a sexist world. The next time someone quotes Paul to silence women, ask, which Paul? The one who worked alongside female apostles, or the one we've twisted to fit our biases? The answer will change everything. If this resonated with you, hit like and share it with someone who's wrestled with these texts. And drop a comment. Have you ever felt conflicted about Paul's words on women? Let's keep this conversation going. Because the church will not move forward until we reckon with the past, and Paul might just be our unexpected ally in the fight for equality.